Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the special immigration show brought to you by Sakshi TV. My name is Ranjit. We are here today with the attorney, Ms. Ansi S. Wagis, today to discuss the latest updates on immigration and frequently asked questions. Before starting the show, I would like to repeat the disclaimer. Please note this show does not provide any legal advice. It is general in nature and it is only for informational purposes. Sakshi TV news and agents are not responsible in any way for your actions. Please use the information at your own risk. For case-specific issues or concerns, please reach out to the attorney and CS Varghese for a private consultation. Before getting into the show, could you please briefly introduce yourself, Ms. Varghese?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ansi Varghese. I'm a U.S. immigration attorney. I have been with Visa Pro since 2013, but I have been practicing employment-based immigration as well as family-based immigration for over 15 years now. Born and brought up in the United States. I am a graduate of New York University and went to Seton Hall Law School in New Jersey. I am barred in both New York and New Jersey. Visa Pro has offices in both Washington, D.C. and New York. I am in the New York office. Of course, due to COVID, all of us are pretty much working from home, but we have clients all over the country as well as all over the world. We have made it a part of our practice to make sure that we can practice from anywhere.
So before starting the show, let's kick off with the latest updates. So could you please give, I believe a lot of people are worried about the travel ban. So could you please give us updates about the travel ban and then we can take it from there?
Yes, unfortunately, there are few exemptions. There is, of course, the national interest exemptions, just like all the other countries, as well as a few other exemptions. For example, if your spouse is a U.S. citizen, legal permanent resident, if your children are U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents, you may be able to be exempt from the ban. The other issue, unfortunately, despite the ban, is that because of the condition in India, especially in New Delhi, Mumbai, getting an appointment, even if you have an exemption. So if you are in India right now, you need to get the H-1B visa, and you have the reason for the NIE exemption, or you have U.S. citizen children. The problem right now, unfortunately, is also just going to be able to get an interview. Right now, a lot of the consulates are limiting their services to only emergencies. So if you're eligible for Dropbox, that was great. And one of the exemptions, you should be okay. But if you're not, you may need to speak with your attorney or your employer to see if there are any other options available, including going to another country. So if you're able to travel to somewhere else and are able to spend 2 weeks there, and if you already have the visa or you are able to get the visa at the U.S. consulate there, that might be another option to look at.
Because of the consulate closure, they sent out emails to everyone stating that non-immigrant visas will not be, the interviews will all be cancelled until further notice. So
yes.
Is the same applicable to the Dropbox as well?
From as far as I can understand, Dropbox may continue, but they will also be limited. So you might be able to continue to use the Dropbox if, of course, in your local area, local lockdowns, of course, look into that because that might affect your ability to even get your application to a Dropbox. But just, other than those kind of restrictions, even Dropbox expect those services to also be limited just because employees are not going into the office. We have also received reports. It was in the news that consular officers, the diplomatic corps in India has been severely affected by COVID as well.
Got it, Ms. Varghese. Thanks for the update. So other option is a lot of people in a lot of groups and blogs talking about the other options to enter US, like traveling to other countries where the visa is not required, like Middle East or Mexico.
Yes.
Could you just give us an update? So how does it work and how safe is it and in terms of immigration?
Right. So in terms of immigration, there's two things you want to look at. One is, can I enter that country without a visa of my own? Think of some countries in the Middle East, some countries in South America, you might be able to go to without a visa. Indian nationals from Mexico, there are actually specific rules about who can go to Mexico, for example. You need to have an existing US visa. If you have a visa, for example, and you're able to travel to a country like Mexico, as long as you spend at least 14 full days there, You're going to come into the United States. They're going to be able to see the evidence that you've spent the last 14 days in Mexico. You should not have a problem entering the United States because there is no travel restriction right now between Mexico and the United States if you're flying in. However, on the other hand, if you don't have a visa, you need to take care of two things. One is, can you enter that country? But number two, is the US consulate in that country entertaining visa applications from third country nationals? That means if you're an Indian national, are you able to go to the US consulate in Mexico to appear for an interview? Many US consulates have restricted, because of COVID, have restricted their services only to nationals of that country or people who are actually residing there. So normally, for example, Canada entertains and Mexico both, customarily entertained visas from third country nationals, including Indian nationals, but they've both restricted those services to only Mexican nationals or Canadian citizens or residents. So that's changing every day. So you need to check both those things before you travel.
It's great advice. Another burning question that a lot of people are facing from the last year is a lot of people who got stuck in India,
Yes.
especially, how the thing work when they work from India and get paid in US. Are there any restrictions on those in terms of immigration?
Finish your question.
And in terms of immigration as well as, do they have to have an H-1B valid visa when they are getting paid in India, or it doesn't really matter, the immigration rules doesn't apply when they are in India, and how companies in US should think of paying and getting the employees work from India?
Okay. So two things to look at. Like you said, first, it's from the employee standpoint. If you are not inside the United States, for the most part, immigration doesn't apply to you. There are a few instances, for example, if you're on OPT and you went for India for vacation, are you going to lose your OPT if you spend too much time in India? So it's not the fact that you're getting employed there, but how much time you're spending there. So that you should speak with an attorney. But for the most part, generally speaking, if you're not inside the United States, immigration, USCIS's rules don't apply to you. So you can continue working for the US company. Now, whether or not it's better for the US company to pay you here in the United States or pay you in India directly, that's going to depend, one, on their finances. So they're going to have to speak with their accountants and attorneys to figure out financially and legally what is best for them. Also for the Indian national. So if they're not here and they are looking at possibly spending an extended period of time in India, getting paid here might entail some sort of taxation. So if they're going, if they're in India completely, they're working for the US company, but they're getting paid in India, they would, they have that benefit of being able to speak to an accountant to find out whether they can then avoid US taxation.
Thanks, Ms. Varghese. Again, for the viewers, if you need any private consultation with the attorney, please reach Ms. Varghese at Visa Pro Law Firm at the phone number 202-787-1944 or visapro.com. Coming to the next update that we have, a lot of people, it's kind of a good news for a lot of people who have been waiting forever. So the recent announcement is H4 and L2 biometric requirement has been removed. Probably it's going to be effective in 10 days or so. Could you please just give a brief update on that?
So pursuant to a lawsuit, it pushed USCIS on their own to announce that as of May 17th, they are suspending the requirement for biometrics for H4 and L2. Now, the reasons, the suspension is technically temporary. The suspension is only for 2 years, but we hope that that will become permanent over the next 2 years. So as everyone knows or may know, 2019, the Trump administration implemented the biometrics requirement for all 539 applications, including H4 and L2, which in and of itself was not so bad. It was very time consuming. Premium processing, of course, then became moot for H4s and L2s. But worse than that is that COVID-19 delays compounded the delays for the H4s and L2. that in itself is bad enough, but the problem is that they were severely delaying the issuance of EADs. So many H4 and L2 beneficiaries were losing jobs, were losing their positions, employers were losing employees because EADs were not getting renewed properly. So the lawsuit says that biometrics for the H4 and L2 will now be suspended, which means that hopefully, and as Ranjit told me earlier, some attorneys are already seeing that there is a possibility that H4 and L2s will be processed with their primary applications, the L1s and the H1Bs under premium processing, if the biometrics is lifted. And that's what we're hopeful for. We return to a case where H4s and L2s will be processed along with the H1B and L1s, and then the EADs will be issued immediately thereafter. So that's what we're hopeful for. If that comes to fruition, the thing is we still have to wait for USCIS to get through the backlog of all those H4s and L2s that are still pending since last year. That's going to take some time, unfortunately.
Apart from the H4 and L2, a lot of other visas like F1, F2, B1, B2 also use the same I-539 form that has a biometric requirement. So is there any news, only the new thing is only applicable to H4, L2, or is it going to be for everything?
We're hopeful that it might eventually be for everything, but the crux of this lawsuit was the H4s and L2s. And the main part of that lawsuit is because of the delays with the H4 and L2s, they were delaying the issuance of the EAD. Now, hopefully for the B2s and F1s, that will also come because the biometrics, for example, has been delaying countless F1 applications. There are thousands of people in the United States waiting for an F1 change of status to go through so they can start school. And in the meantime, while their F1 has been pending 10, 12, 15 months, they have to renew their B2 extensions every 6 months as well. And that's a cost factor that's been huge for a lot of individuals waiting in the United States for their F1. So we're hopeful that eventually USCIS will also rescind the biometrics requirement for those applications.
Other thing, a lot of people have been waiting for, and I believe there's a bill passed by Congress regarding the premium process for EADs, H4s, and I-485 and other forms. I believe it was around October, November, and the Congress gave 180 days time. And I believe it's almost close to 180 days are over, but there is no update from USCIS. Do you think?
Nothing. We have not received anything from USCIS. The thing is, because of a combination of COVID and still dealing with the delays that they've been dealing with since last April, the implementation of that premium processing, I could easily see USCIS trying to push that off a little longer. They need more people. They could, if USCIS, I mean, realistically, if they implemented premium processing right now, there are many people who are willing to pay that extra fee for the premium processing, but USCIS is short-staffed as it is. That's what immigration attorneys have been pushing the service to add more employees. They desperately need to add more people. They just don't have enough resources to take care of the applications that they're receiving right now.
Yeah, when we talk about premium process, I'm hearing a lot of news in the blogs and groups saying that even though people apply for premium process, USCIS is failing to respond and they don't even get receipts, they don't even get any update even after 15, 20 days. And they are in kind of in between and they don't know what to do, what not to do, even after the premium process fee has been increased, almost doubled, I believe.
Yes, we've been same thing. Some service centers, if we're lucky, we get the email receipt. Sometimes we're getting the request for evidence or the approval notice before we even see a receipt notice. And remember, at some point late last year, they changed it from 15 business days to 15 calendar days. So it's not 2 weeks anymore. It's more like 3 weeks. So you have to keep that in mind. A lot of people are still on the 15 days calendar days schedule. USCIS switched it over to 15 business days. So that's more like 3 weeks now. USCIS premium processing California, for example, won't even respond to emails. If we've filed something and to try to get an update from them has become near impossible, whereas other service centers are not as bad. So I think it's going to take some time. There's, a top to bottom, hopefully, cleaning out and restructuring is hopefully underway with the new administration.
I was also hearing things like, yeah, earlier attorneys or employees used to get facts of the RFEs, denials, or
Mhm.
NOIDs, but
Yes.
we are not getting it anymore. Is that right?
No, it depends on the service center. For example, we consistently have no problem with getting it from Vermont. On the other hand, California, sometimes we have to follow up with them 2 or 3 times for them to send it. Sometimes the employer is getting it, we're not getting it. We had one instance where the employer got the fax instead of us getting the fax. So that has also been a problem. And unfortunately, other than following up with them, there's really no way to get around it.
Okay, let's jump into the other important topic, the visa bulletin
Mhm.
and the
Yes.
latest update. So I believe Department of State is doing a good thing every month, conducting a meeting and stating that, they are going to have every month meeting stating that it's
Yes.
going to be an update on the visa bulletin. And I believe Mr.
Yes.
Oppenheim had a lot of updates. Could you please share some important updates to the viewers?
The good thing is, I mean, he's confirmed, for example, in the latest meeting, confirmed that at least for India, we shouldn't expect any more retrogression. That's what everyone has been fearful of with the deluge of the thousands of applications that USCIS must probably received last October, November, December, when India's dates advanced in EB3. We were fearful. Some attorneys were fearful that India would retrogress again to correct for that. But Mr. Oppenheimer has at least confirmed that at least through September, he does not expect to see any more India retrogression. The dates are going to stay at least where they are right now. And then he actually expects them to move forward. This year, there's going to be, the consulates still have not returned back to normal processing. India, as you see, many places in South America. So even this year, Mr. Oppenheimer also confirmed that it's unlikely they're going to be using all the visa numbers. So we're hopefully going to get some unused numbers in India for the quota so that, hopefully we'll move EB2 and EB3 a little further along this year. So those are the two biggest updates that I saw.
How many green cards or I-485s have been processed in the first quarter? And we were seeing that they only processed about 27,000 out of
Yeah.
260,000. That's like a 10% of it. So do you
Yes.
think they are going to use all the green card numbers, or they are going to waste?
Definitely.
Because
They're not, I mean, like I said, because the consulates and even adjustment of status interviews, what we're hoping is USCIS completely returns back to the previous practice of waiving employment-based interviews. So having employment-based interviews for EB2, EB3, EB1 routinely is not something that we saw for many years. And then the last administration instituted that about 3 years ago, about 4 years ago. And that is part of this backlog. So now these adjustment of status interviews from USCIS, plus, there's still closures all over the country due to COVID. And so I don't think even USCIS is going to be able to use all the numbers. And so that's a bad thing because there are so many people who are waiting for their green cards in the United States. But those unused numbers hopefully will push the numbers for India or China a little bit, hopefully by the end of the year.
yeah, hopefully they allocate the numbers at least, so they are not going into trash. Because I believe
Exactly. They're not going
all
to
the
go in the
waste
trash. They definitely go back into the mix. The thing is, India will only get 7%. So that's the only problem. If we got all of them, that'd be great.
Yeah, hopefully, I believe because of the family-based ban until, I believe it was until March, though I believe they are going to be more in the next year as well, and we probably
Oh,
will be
yes,
seeing more.
definitely. It's going to take a couple of years for everything to turn back to normal. Unfortunately, it's going to be a long road.
Again, if you would like to reach to the attorney for a private consultation, please reach Ms. Varghese of Visa Pro Law Firm at 202-787-1944 or visapro.com. Going back to the other questions, a lot of people who got EADs and APs, they have a lot of questions like how to use EAD, how to use AP, and what happens if I use EAD or AP.
Right.
Could you please give some benefits and limitations or risks of EADs and APs?
Okay, so for anyone who's currently on H-1B, of course, the EAD is almost it's your key to freedom, right? You don't have to work for a specific employer. You can do part-time. If you can, pursue that dream that you had of, being a I don't know, you wanted to be a teacher so you can go work part-time anywhere you want. That's the biggest upside to the EAD. This is the freedom that affords you. Once your adjustment of, if your I-140 is approved, your adjustment of status has been approved, filed and pending for at least 180 days, you become what's called portable, which means that you can port to any job as long as it's same or similar, and you can start working for that employer as soon as that, as long as you have that EAD. You don't have to worry about whether that employer is going to transfer the H-1B, but there are some downsides. There is no guarantee your green card is going to be approved until your green card is approved. So I've had many instances where I've had clients who went off of H-1B. They've been working for several years on their EAD, and all of a sudden a great opportunity arises and they want to go back to India, or they want to go back to their home country, work there for a few years. Not having that H-1B could be detrimental, because you still have to come back every year to renew that advanced parole, because once you start working on the EAD, the H-1B is no longer valid. And then to travel, you have to use advanced parole, which means you have to be here physically in the United States when the advanced parole is still valid to renew your advanced parole. And then there's a biometrics requirement usually for the EAD. So it becomes, it might give you a little less freedom in the future if you're going to use your EAD and advanced parole. So definitely, whether you're using, if you want to switch off of H-1B to EAD, talk to your attorney before doing it, because you want to listen to all the pros, you want to listen to all the cons, because it is not 100%, there are some downsides. If your adjustment of status gets denied and you're still on H-1B, the biggest benefit of having that H-1B is you don't have to worry about being out of status. You can continue working without interruption, and you can refile the adjustment of status if you need to. Not so easy if you're working on EAD and advanced parole. Another restriction, remember, with advanced parole, always carry it when you're traveling. If you are traveling with advanced parole, that's another benefit of advanced parole, is if there are delays with the consulate, or there's, they give you one of those administrative processing 214B denials at the consulate, and you're looking at a 3-4 month wait in your home country to get that H-1B visa, you can use the advanced parole to enter. So it's always good to have. I always recommend that my adjustment of status clients apply for the advanced parole and always have it with them when they travel, because you never know when you're going to need it.
Thanks, Ms. Buggis. Another question is, let's say the family got EADs and advanced parole. Can one of them, like his spouse, be on H-1B and just the dependent can use EAD, or the vice versa? Only the main applicant can use the advanced parole EAD, and the spouse can be on H-4 or H-1 or whatever. Is that possible?
Only one way. So the main applicant can be an H-1B, and their derivatives, their beneficiary, their dependent spouse and children can start using their EAD and advanced parole. Technically, they're no longer in H-4 status. So if we're using the example of H-1 and H-4s, they're technically no longer in H-4 status, but the main H-1B holder status will not change. If something should happen to the EAD advanced parole, getting them back into H-4 status is as simple as getting them to go to a consulate, getting an H-4 visa, and coming back. It's also a very good idea if you have the EAD advanced parole. For example, your priority date might be locked in, but you have a child who's approaching 21, they'll be protected by the EAD and advanced parole in some cases, not in all cases. However, the reverse does not work. The main applicant can't go off of H-1. If they go off on H-1, the H-4 automatically is void. So in order to keep the H-4 valid, you have to be on H-1. The main person has to stay on H-1.
A lot of people now have downgraded these days, and all the downgrades are pending. And as per AC-21, I believe after 180 days, the employee can move to another employer by filing 485J. But what happens if the downgrade is still pending? Is it advisable to move after 180 days, even if downgrade of I-140 is pending, or it should be approved to make it easier?
I always recommend, my strongest recommendation is wait until the I-140 is approved before you do any type of porting, just because that it's a very dangerous move. You're risking a lot by leaving that employer because they can decide to withdraw that I-140. There is a mechanism that USCIS has to go through. If you port after the 180 days, but the I-140 is still pending, but it's not easy. And it's question, I haven't seen any USCIS cases from the last few years. So this was when I-140 porting 2000, when this first started happening, there were a few cases. But since then, you're dealing with officers who have no idea on what to do if someone ports when an I-140 is still pending. So I would strongly recommend against leaving your employer until the I-140 is approved. Just note, if your I-140 has already been pending for 4 or 5 months at this point, you should be able to upgrade to premium processing by now.
Okay, yeah. Coming to that question, a lot of people were saying if they try to file premium, but because the downgrade doesn't have an original perm, a lot of people got rejection from USCIS saying that we cannot do premium. So that's the case with a lot of things. So is there any way that this can be handled?
So you can upgrade to premium once USCIS has gotten that duplicate labor certification. So on the I-140, usually on a downgrade, I will select request duplicate labor certification from Department of Labor. That usually takes about 2 to 4 months for USCIS to get it from Department of Labor. Once they get it, then the case can be premium processed. So our timeline generally is about 4 to 5 months after an I-140 refile or downgrade is filed. You can try premium processing. The worst they're going to do is reject it, which means all you lost is really the postage. Wait a month and you can try again. At some point, once they have the original labor cert from Department of Labor, they should be able to take the premium processing request.
Got it. That's a great advice. Another question is, a lot of people who have both the H-1B as well as advanced parole, but while entering the country, they choose to enter on advanced parole, let's assume.
Yes.
So what happens? What will be their status, and will they be successfully able to extend their H-1Bs in the country? There are a lot of things a lot of people say.
Yes. So this is a very a weird little part of the law, but technically they're a parolee, right? But if their H-1B is intact, their H-1B remains intact. So if their H-1, they do have an approved H-1B that remains intact. Once that H-1B comes up for renewal, they should be able to renew that H-1B, even though they entered on advanced parole. So once that H-1B is filed and that extension is approved, they're back in H-1B status.
Is it the same case when they try to transfer?
It should be.
Different employer.
It should be. But that is, trying to convince you, because this is all based on memos that came out about, at this point, almost 20 years ago. So regulations and memos that are not, always implemented properly. So, you'd have to make sure that the attorney who's preparing that type of application really, has included all that information in the petition.
Thanks, Ms. Varghese. One last question before we end the show. What are the options the students have, especially when the OPT is already exhausted? I believe there is a CPT day one option, but how complicated is it? And what are the pros and cons, and what are the options they have?
Right. Day one CPT, there's nothing wrong with day one CPT. USCIS doesn't like day one CPT. They really, whenever for future applications, they really make that student really prove that day one CPT was really required for their degree. It's not really complicated. It's just a matter of getting admission to a school that offers day one CPT. What we advise our clients to look out for is it is a legitimate school. Make sure that they are requiring you to go to class. Some schools, the requirement is once a month or only on the weekends, but it's class. You have to go in, you have to appear in person. If the school is saying, okay, there's only online class or you don't have to come to class, that's a big red flag. If they're saying it to you, they're saying it to everyone, and that kind of information gets back to ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. And you don't want to be enrolled in a school that's under investigation from ICE or Department of Homeland Security. So those are kind of the red flags you want to look for. If they offer day one CPT, that's fine, but make sure that it's a legitimate degree program. You're going to class, they're making you get books, you know who your teacher is, there are actual tests or projects or papers that are due. If you're not doing any work, if you don't have to go to class, that's a huge red flag, and I would stay away from those types of schools.
That's a great advice. Thanks, Ms. Varghese. Thanks for your time. Again, if anyone wants to reach Ms. Varghese for a private consultation, please reach her at 202-787-1944 or visapro.com. Visa Pro Law Firm is the name. So please reach out to the attorney if you need any private consultation or any help, and the attorney would be glad to help. Again, thanks, Ms. Varghese. Thanks for watching the show. It was a great session with interesting topics and questions. Please call into our immigration shows for more information. This is Ranjit signing off.